3 days after Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped off the tarmac in Beijing, the ink on his handshake deal had barely dried before the market responded with surgical precision. A Chinese importer placed an order for 60,000 metric tons of Canadian canola seed. This was not a routine transaction. It was a calibrated market signal. While farmers in North Dakota, Kansas, and Iowa spent the better part of 2025 watching their primary export market turn to dust, Canadian producers just witnessed the immediate restoration of the exact trade architecture. Washington spent 2 years systematically dismantling. The official narrative suggests this is merely a restoration of prior stability. Do not be misled by that framing. This is a deliberate, sequenced pivot that exposes the widening fracture between American protectionist strategies and the cold transactional reality of global agricultural logistics. To understand why this move shifts the geopolitical chessboard, one must look at the timeline that led to this moment. In October 2024, Ottawa aligned its trade posture with the United States, slapping a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and a 25% levy on steel and aluminum. It was a demonstration of continental solidarity. Beijing's retaliation was equally calculated. By March 2025, China unleashed a targeted strike on Canada's agricultural heartland. 100% tariffs on canola oil, canola meal and peas, alongside 25% penalties on pork and seafood. The objective was to make the cost of Canadian political alignment prohibitively expensive. It succeeded. Within months, Canadian canola exports to China cratered to zero. Canadian farm cash receipts plummeted by 9% in the first 3 quarters of 2025. The loss of a $4.9 billion Canadian dollar market did not just hurt the bottom line, it forced a total reassessment of Canada's trade sovereignty, while Ottawa sat in the crossfire. Washington's pressure campaign was supposed to force Beijing into a subservient position. It did the opposite. The American agricultural sector, particularly soybean producers, saw export volumes to China collapse from $12 billion in 2024 to a mere $3 billion in 2025. Between May and November, the United States exported virtually nothing, not a single bushel of soybeans, to its largest customer. The American Farm Bureau logged $34.6 billion in losses. The response from the White House was a $12 billion federal bailout, a temporary sedative, not a market solution. During this void, Beijing did not wait for the Americans to come to their senses. They built new supply chains. Brazil, the primary beneficiary of Washington's strategic miscalculation, is now projected to control 59% of global soybean exports for the 2025-2026 season. The supply chains for the Chinese market are no longer American-centric. They are operational, profitable, and deeply entrenched in South America. This is the hidden cost of the last 2 years. The United States traded market dominance for political posturing, leaving its farmers to rely on government checks while Brazil secured the structural flow of trade. When Carney arrived in Beijing in January 2026, he bypassed the high-minded rhetoric of the trade war and went straight to the ledger. He returned with a deal that unlocks $6.6 billion Canadian dollars in trade access. China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% to 15%, effective March 1, 2026. This move restores roughly $4 billion in annual exports. Beijing also suspended punitive tariffs on peas, lobster, crab, and canola meal, another $2.6 billion in relief. In exchange, Canada provided a modest concession, allowing 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market annually at a 6.1% tariff rate, while maintaining strict guardrails against security-sensitive investments. This was not a free trade agreement. This was a rectification of a failed containment strategy. Canada has effectively carved out a transactional space that acknowledges the geopolitical reality. China needs high-quality agricultural inputs, and Canada needs a market that isn't tethered to the volatility of Washington's internal political cycle. The immediate resumption of canola shipments confirms that the buyers in China were not just waiting for prices to drop. They were waiting for the political signal that the door was open. While the Canadian agricultural sector is now recalibrating for a 2026 season that offers genuine market access, the American heartland remains trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting on a framework commitment from Beijing that lacks formal confirmation. The strategy behind the Carney-XC deal is clear. By decoupling its agricultural survival from the broader, failing US-China containment effort, Ottawa has managed to secure a foothold in a market that the United States has arguably lost for the foreseeable future. The Canadian farmer now has a customer. The American farmer has a promise of federal aid. But as the trade flows resume and the immediate shock of the tariff removal fades, a deeper, more uncomfortable question surfaces. If Canada can navigate this narrow corridor of sovereignty by playing the game of strategic reciprocity, what does this say about the shelf life of the existing North American trade alliance? The deal is signed, the ships are being loaded, and the market has already moved on. Yet, the most critical question remains. Can Ottawa maintain this delicate balance, or has Canada just signalled to Washington that its path to national interest will no longer be dictated by the demands of the American Farm Belt? That pivot brings us to the core of the matter, the architecture of the deal itself. It is not just a commercial transaction. It is a structural realignment designed to isolate Canada's agricultural economy from the volatility of Washington's trade wars. While the headline focused on the restoration of market access, the granular details reveal a sophisticated exchange of economic leverage. First, consider the precision of the tariff reset. By slashing the combined canola seed tariff from nearly 85% to 14.9%, the agreement effectively dismantles the primary barrier that had zeroed out Canadian exports in 2025. This is not a partial adjustment. It is a total reopening of a $4 billion a year market. Beijing, in a rare move, coupled this with a suspension of anti-discrimination duties on canola meal, peas, lobster and crab through the end of 2026. This creates a predictable window for Canadian exporters to re-establish supply chains that were systematically severed during the tariff escalation of the previous year. Second, the cost of this access. The 49,000 unit quota for Chinese electric vehicles at a 6.1% tariff is strategically calculated. Ottawa, while appearing to break ranks with the US protectionist wall, actually anchored this concession to pre-dispute import volumes. This represents less than 3% of Canada's total annual new vehicle market. It is a controlled entry, not an open floodgate. Crucially, the agreement includes an approval timeline of 8 weeks for new models and mandates that half of this quota be dedicated to lower-cost vehicles, aligning with Canadian domestic consumer demand for affordability without threatening the high-value automotive manufacturing base. Third, the scope of the deal extends well beyond the immediate tariff relief, touching on the regulatory friction points that have hindered Canadian exports for years. By securing the resumption of beef market access for 20 registered Canadian establishments and clearing the path for porcine and bovine genetics, the federal government addressed the non-tariff barriers that had essentially locked Canadian meat producers out of the Chinese market since 2021. The signing of new pet food safety protocols further underscores the intent. Beijing is not just buying commodity crops. It is opening a broader lane for Canadian value-added agricultural products. The why here is hidden in the silence of the American trade desk. While Washington focused on forcing a change in Chinese economic behaviour through high-pressure tariffs, only to find their farmers replaced by Brazilian suppliers, Ottawa opted for a transactional reciprocal model. The Canadian government secured a roadmap to increase total exports to China by 50% by 2030. An ambitious target that serves as a hedge against the possibility that the US-Canada-Mexico Agreement, USMCA, undergoes significant instability during the 2026 review. This deal is not a romantic return to engagement, it is a cold, pragmatic assessment of where the demand is. Beijing needed a reliable, high-volume source of non-American canola to continue its own food security planning. And Canada needed a market to replace the artificial volatility imposed by its southern neighbour. By trading a small, capped quota of EVs for access to their primary agricultural market, Canada effectively bought its way back into the room, but as the first ships carrying Canadian canola crossed the Pacific. The question is no longer about the deal itself, but about its durability. Can Canada continue to operate this separate trade lane if Washington demands a unified front on Chinese market access during the upcoming USMCA negotiations? Or have we just seen the first move in a long game to prioritise Canadian survival over continental consensus? The Carnegie Sea Agreement represents more than a tactical tariff swap. It marks the definitive end of Canada's era of a reflexive alignment with American protectionist trade policy. By successfully decoupling its agricultural survival from Washington's failed containment strategy, Ottawa has signalled that its economic sovereignty will no longer be sacrificed on the altar of a continental united front that has delivered little more than lost market share and federal bailout dependency for the North American Farm Belt. The implications for the broader geopolitical landscape are stark and unavoidable. For years, the pre-Trump status quo relied on a unified North American bloc to dictate terms to global partners. That era is over. The 2026 reality is a fragmented global order where middle powers like Canada are increasingly forced to prioritise direct, bilateral engagement over alliance-based ideology to avoid economic obsolescence. While Washington remains mired in the pursuit of a zero-sum trade war that has effectively ceded the soybean market to Brazil, Canada has secured a pragmatic, if narrow, corridor for its key commodities. This is not a shift toward Beijing, but a shift toward market realism. This divergence carries profound risks for the upcoming July 2026 USMCA review. By reaching a deal that actively lowers barriers for Chinese electric vehicles, even within a capped quota, Canada has handed Washington a significant point of contention. The White House will almost certainly frame this as a breach of the spirit of North American integration, potentially using the USMCA review as a weapon to demand full compliance with US trade belligerents. We are entering a period where Ottawa's drive for export diversification directly conflicts with the American desire for total supply chain enclosure. The consequences for sectors like defence, energy, and advanced manufacturing will be felt in the coming months. If Ottawa continues to pursue this pragmatic turn, it risks a retaliatory cycle that could see the US weaponize energy access or supply chain mandates in an attempt to force Canada back into line. We are no longer watching a routine trade dispute. We are watching a fundamental restructuring of Canada's strategic identity. The next critical juncture arrives in less than a month, the USMCA review. We will soon see if the Canadian government's calculated gamble in Beijing was a masterstroke of sovereign navigation or a catalyst for an irreversible collapse of the North American Trade Pact. Either way, the era of relying on American trade policy to secure Canadian prosperity has reached its expiration date.